All right, I thought this week we'd we'd take a break from the topic that we've been studying and study about something different, and that is talk about mission congregations. I'm just going to share my notes this week, and so I think it's important that we. My wife told me, which I appreciate, I say too much. So I look over, I see that face, and I knew exactly what I was doing. I will try not to do that. That was on purpose. So it's important for us as the New Testament church to look into God's Word and make sure that we're always doing things according to the pattern which He's given to us in His Word. So I thought tonight we'd talk about the New Testament model for mission churches. Take a look at the approach that Paul used in dealing with in developing these congregations, and especially as it pertains to the way they supported themselves and others. And so we want to do the same thing. We want to compare what we do with what they did in the New Testament. So as a way of reminder, Paul took 3 mission trips, and the first one is approximately 47 to 49 AD, and he established congregations in Antioch, in Antioch of Pisidia, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. And this was, of course, his shortest missionary journey, and they all started here in Antioch of Syria. The second missionary journey was approximately 50 to 52 AD. If you remember, he asked Barnabas, he said, let's go and visit the congregations that we had taught at before. And there was a dissension among them because John Mark had left them on the first missionary journey. So instead of taking Barnabas with him, he took Silas with him. And again, they started in Antioch of Syria, and they went through the places that they had preached before. Now, it shows them going through Tarsus here. The Bible does not indicate that they did that. They may have done that, but they went through these congregations here, and those congregations were the congregations in Galatia. So, when he wrote the letter to the churches of Galatia, it would have included these 4. Went over onto Troas, and that's where he saw the vision of a man saying, come over to Macedonia to help us. So they went to Philippi, and we know that in Philippi in Acts chapter 16, Paul and Silas were imprisoned, and that's where we have the account of the Philippian jailer. When they left there, they went to Thessalonica and Berea, and those are the congregations of Macedonia. Okay, so churches of Galatia, churches of Macedonia, and then he went down to Athens and Corinth is in Achaia. And so that's the second missionary journey. This third one's very similar, except instead of going across the Aegean Sea here, on his third missionary journey, he doubled back and went around the Aegean Sea again, and then on to Jerusalem. But that missionary journey was roughly 53 to 57 AD. So I would like to take a look at the challenge that Paul made to these young congregations. And we're going to spend a lot of our time tonight in looking at the church at Corinth. Corinth in 49 AD, Claudius Caesar, he issued an edict for all the Jews to leave Rome, and we read about that in in Acts chapter 18 and verse 2. And then it was the following year, approximately, that Paul came and visited Corinth on his second missionary journey, and he established the congregation there. And he stayed there for a year and a half. And then, about 4 years later, he wrote his first letter to the Corinthians, and he wrote that from the city of Ephesus. And that would have been on his third missionary journey. So, established roughly 50 AD, he wrote his first letter to them in 54, about 4 years later. So I want to look at some verses in 1 Corinthians in that first letter that he wrote to them, and let's see what he has to say to them about giving and about supporting not only themselves as a congregation, but supporting other people who are teaching and preaching to them. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 7, he starts off, he said, "Whoever goes to war at his own expense, who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruit, or who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk of the flock?" Verse 9, "For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox which treads out, while it treads out the grain." And then in verse 11 it says, "If we have sown spiritual things to you, is it a great thing if we reap your material things? If others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? Nevertheless, we have not used this right, but we endure all things lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat of the things of the temple, and those who serve at the altar partake of the offering of the altar? Even so the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel." So, 3 to 4 years after they established the congregation in Corinth, Paul is writing to them, and he writes to them regarding their financial responsibility to support the men who preach and teach to them. Paul affirmed with a rhetorical question in verse 11, says that it was expected that he, as an apostle, and especially the apostle who had taught them initially, who had established the congregation there, he writes to them and he shows that it's expected as that they would support him, but also those who were working with him. He says to them that those who work spiritually should partake of the worldly possessions as well. So you think about that. This congregation's roughly 4 years old, and he's telling them that they need to be giving of their money to those who teach to them. Now, I want you to think about that as far as in today's world, when a congregation is established, do we have the same expectations for these new congregations? So Paul says that others were partaking of this right in verse 12, and they were receiving wages from the church at Corinth. And so Paul does not condemn those other teachers for reaping the benefits, but he states that others involved in preaching at Corinth had a greater right. And of course, he was essentially their spiritual father in that he established the congregation. So implied in these verses is the expectation that this younger congregation was capable of financially supporting Paul and those who taught with him. And also, I think it's implied that they were responsible for supporting themselves as well, any needs that the congregation had as well. Later on in chapter 16, he says, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia." So you remember the churches of Galatia? Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe. He's written to them, and he's already commanded them, right? And they're young congregations in relative terms, maybe 5, 6 years old at the most. And he says, As I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must do also. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come. And when I come, whomever you approve by your letters, I will send to bear your gift to Jerusalem. So it wasn't just Corinth that he expected to support themselves and support those who taught them. He also expected the same thing from the churches of Galatia as well. And as we'll see, he also expected the same thing from the churches of Macedonia. But he said they were to lay something aside. So this was something in excess of, the daily needs that the congregation would have had. This was for the poor brethren that were in Jerusalem. You remember he was collecting this gift for those who were poor in Judea, and he was going to take it back to them. It not only served to help these poor people, but what other good benefit was there from him doing this?
Well, it's beneficial for givers.
Okay, it was beneficial for the givers. Yeah. Why do you think he was, he was collecting all of these funds and taking them back to Jerusalem, other than the fact that it was going to help those who were needy? Think about the context of the first century. It was going to show the Jews who were in Jerusalem that the Gentiles cared about them, right? You remember in the first century, when the Gentiles were allowed into the church, that was hard for the Jews to accept. And so by him collecting these contributions from these Gentile congregations and taking them and giving it to the Jews in Judea, the Christian Jews, they're showing good faith. They're showing that they care about the Jews. It was a way of bonding the Jews and the Gentiles together to help this transition happen faster than it would have otherwise. Comments? It says, I'm going to bear your gift to Jerusalem. So this was something in addition to what they would give and in the needs of their own congregation. So he expected them, regardless of their youthful status, to give towards the efforts of others, and in this case, the needy brethren at Jerusalem. Like I said, these congregations were fairly young. All right, in his second letter to the church at Corinth, he wrote that roughly about 57. So now the church at Corinth is 6 or 7 years old. He writes to them, and it says in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, and in this confidence I intended to come to you before, that you might have a second benefit, to pass by you to Macedonia, to come again from Macedonia to you, and be helped by you on my way to Judea. So when he writes Second Corinthians, he's right above them in Macedonia, right? And he's writing this letter. One of the reasons why he's writing this letter is because he's getting ready to collect their gift to take back to Jerusalem. But as we'll see, he's bragged about them to the churches of Macedonia. And when he gets to Corinth, he wants them to be ready with their gift so that he's not embarrassed and they're not embarrassed. And so he says, I expect to be helped by you on my way to Judea. So he was expecting financial support to get the rest of the way to his destination. In chapter 8, he says, moreover, brethren, we make known to you the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia, that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded in the riches of their liberality. For I bear witness that according to their ability, yes, and beyond their ability, they were freely willing, imploring us with much urgency that we would receive the gift and the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. And not only as we had hoped, but they first gave themselves to the Lord and then to us by the will of God. So we urge Titus that as he has begun, so he would also complete this grace in you as well. But as you abound in everything, in faith and speech and knowledge and all diligence, and in your love for us, see that you abound in this grace also. And then in verse 24, he says, therefore show to them and before the churches the proof of your love and our boasting on your behalf. So Paul's in Macedonia. He's getting ready to send Titus down to them. And Titus, no doubt, delivered this letter to them. And so he's telling them what he expects of them. Do you notice what he's doing here with the church at Corinth? He's prompting them to give as they should, right? And what approach is he using? What method is he using here?
Competition is really not the best choice of words, but he's using the giving in Macedonia as proof of, like, hey, they're doing it well.
Right.
They're doing it really well.
Right.
I expect you guys to do it well.
Exactly.
Also.
Peer pressure. Right. Positive peer pressure. Right. That's exactly right. And so he's saying, hey, churches of Macedonia, in their deep poverty, are giving liberally. And the expectation is, the same for you. You should be giving every bit as much. And so they did it willingly. And he's not only expecting them to give a certain amount, but he's also teaching them to give with a certain attitude, using the Macedonians as an example. And so he says, see that you abound in this grace also. A grace is just a pleasing or an attractive quality, but he's challenging them to develop this grace. And so what I want us to think about, our mission congregations that we support and all mission congregations that are established, we should be telling them, we should be teaching them that they need to develop the grace of giving, that they need to be supporting themselves and others as soon as possible. All right. In chapter 9, he says this, verses 1 through 5. Now, concerning the ministering to the saints, it is superfluous. That's not how you say that word. Superfluous, right? Superfluous? Superfluous, I think is how you say it. I just say needless or unnecessary. He says it's unnecessary for me to write to you, for I know your willingness, about which I boast to you, to the Macedonians, that Achaia was ready a year ago, and your zeal has stirred up the majority. Yet I have sent the brethren, lest our boasting of you should be in vain. In this respect, that I said you may be ready, lest if some Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, not to mention you, should be ashamed of this confident boasting. Therefore, I thought it necessary to exhort the brethren to go to you ahead of time and prepare your generous gift beforehand, which you had previously promised, that it may be ready as a matter of generosity and not as a grudging obligation. So again, he's applying this peer pressure to them, reminding them that they had promised to give this gift, right? And he's wanting them to fulfill their promise. He's been boasting about them to the Macedonians, and he doesn't want to look bad. He doesn't want them to look bad. And he's encouraging them to be generous, not just generous, but to be willing, not out of generosity and not grudgingly. So in verses 10 and 11, he says, and in this I give advice. It is to your advantage not only to be doing what you began and were desiring to do a year ago, but now you must also complete the doing of it, that as there was a readiness to desire it, so there may also be a completion of what you have. So he's writing to them, keep your promise, keep the commitment that you made, and finish what you started. And then in chapter 11 and verse 7 through 9, he says, did I commit a sin in humbling myself that you might be exalted, because I preached the gospel of God to you free of charge? I robbed other churches, taking wages from them to minister to you. And when I was present with you and in need, I was a burden to no one. For what I lacked, the brethren who came from Macedonia supplied. And in everything, I kept myself from being burdensome to you, and so I will keep myself. So he's reminding the church at Corinth. He says, when I was there, when I was first there, and I stayed a year and a half with you, he says, I didn't take any money from you. And he's really rebuking them in a mild way here, saying, the churches of Macedonia supplied what I needed while I preached to you. Now, you think about that. The churches of Macedonia weren't any older than the church at Corinth, and yet they were doing what the church of Corinth should have been doing for themselves. So he's rebuking them in a way here, and telling them that they need to, that they could have done better. Comments or questions?
I just think about the age of the churches that you pointed out in the beginning. I've not done any church planting or anything like that, but in 3 to 5 to 7 years, whatever, at least in a little bit of knowledge that I have, it usually takes a lot longer than that from, I guess, what I've seen. But again, I haven't really been around, if you will. I don't know if others have additional perspective. 3 years are, I don't know.
Yeah, so Jason says, he thinks it takes longer than that for congregations nowadays to sort of get on their feet financially. And I wonder, is that because the expectation is lower for them? Paul was telling them, and we're going to look at the church at Corinth here. He's telling them from the onset to pony up. It's your responsibility to give. And so let's take a look at the church at Philippi. He's writing the Philippian letter from prison, and this is about 62 or 63, about 12, 13 years after the church at Philippi was established. And he says to them, nevertheless, you have done well that you shared in my distress. So while he was in prison, they had sent Epaphroditus to Rome to give him a gift while he was in prison. And that's what he's referring to. Nevertheless, you have done well that you shared in my distress. Now, you Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed Macedonia, no church shared with me concerning giving and receiving, but you only. For you, even in Thessalonica, you sent aid once and again for my necessities. Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that abounds in your account. Indeed, I have all and abound. I am full, having received from Epaphroditus the things sent from you, a sweet-smelling aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, well-pleasing to God. So he reminds them that when he was with them, that was in Acts chapter 16, when he was in prison with Silas, that once he left and went on to Thessalonica, that they had helped support him when he left them. And he says they were the only church to do so. So he's commending them for their giving. He said they not only did it once, but they did it twice. They did it once and again for my necessities. Now it's 12 years later, Paul's writing to them from prison, and he's thanking them for their generosity. But the main praise of their gift was for the good that it did them. Paul was more interested in the benefits they derived. By giving to Paul like they did, they were laying up treasures in heaven for themselves, and he speaks of the fruit that abounded to their account. So I want to look at the idea of this fruit. What is this fruit? And I think when we look into the New Testament, we see that When congregations, when people give scripturally and sincerely, it develops within them a spirit of sacrifice, which is necessary for Christian maturity because, right, as Christians, our lives are all about sacrifice. Romans chapter 12, verse 1. It helps to overcome selfishness, which is so important. You think about it, every sin that I can think of has its roots in selfishness. And so when giving, it helps us to overcome that tendency to be selfish. And also, giving is an expression or a proof of our love for God and for others. So giving primarily benefits the giver. And Jesus said this. We don't have it recorded in the Gospels, but Luke wrote it in Acts chapter 20 and verse 35. He reminds them that Jesus said, "It is more blessed to give than to receive." And so the Philippian gift was acceptable and well-pleasing to God. God took note of their gift and was going to reward them immensely. They didn't have a lot, but God was going to be generous to them from his unlimited storehouse of blessings. All right, are there any comments before we start the next section? That's the challenges that Paul gave to the congregations that he established. His expectations were clear. He expected them to give, and he expected them to support those who taught them. Now, let's look at the challenge to us today. As a congregation that's able to provide financial support, we need to consider whether our support is in the best interest of the recipient congregation. Our intentions are good when we assist mission congregations, but just like parents eventually have to cut the apron strings with their children, sponsoring congregations were never intended to support mission congregations in perpetuity. In fact, the New Testament, if you think about it, we never read of another congregation that I'm aware of supporting a mission congregation financially in any long-term way. In fact, I think we read just the opposite. These congregations were expected to stand on their own 2 feet right from the beginning. And so by our unending support, we may be hindering the mission congregation's development of fruit. We may be hindering their development of a spirit of sacrifice, a spirit of selflessness. We may be hindering them from fully expressing their love for God and others through their giving. We need to ask ourselves, does our support further enable the dependency of the mission congregation? A mission congregation will never learn to give as God intends it to if another congregation is doing their giving for them. A mission congregation will never fulfill their full potential if they are never weaned off the support of the sponsoring congregation. And as we've seen, the mission congregations in the New Testament were expected to be self-supporting almost immediately, but were expected from the onset of their existence to help the Apostle Paul and other evangelists in continuing to spread the gospel. We are also challenged and commanded to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Supporting mission congregations indefinitely is detrimental to our spiritual efforts by limiting our ability to fulfill the Great Commission. If we are financially tethered to a specific congregation, to a specific mission effort for decades, it hinders us from sending men into new territories where the gospel has not been preached. We are challenged to step out of our comfort zone. Working with the same people in established mission work is comfortable. Having established relationships with individuals in mission congregations is comfortable. But however, the others throughout the world are dying without hearing the gospel. And as such, we need to look at other opportunities and venture beyond our routine. We need to discuss other mission efforts with missionaries. We need to explore other parts of the world to plant the seed of the gospel. We need to create strategic plans for establishing new congregations with a plan to separate from those congregations in a timely fashion. We are challenged to adhere to the New Testament pattern to establish mission congregations and then let them become self-sufficient. Our challenge is to let the mission congregations develop spiritually so they themselves can become supporting congregations and in turn plant the gospel in their own mission fields. So those are all my notes. So, does anybody have any comments? Yes.
Retired preachers and supporting those from a particular congregation, where do you think that falls in the realm of the study that we just walked through there? I mean, how do you think that, let's just say, we'll just use Tim because he's here. Tim retires and then we decide to offer some type of support thereafter. Where do you think that falls into the camp of what we have here?
I think it's fine to support a man. I just think that we see in the New Testament that it's very temporary, that it's very short term. Whether it be, a retired minister or it be a young missionary, I think what we see in the New Testament is that, we establish congregations and then, we get them on their feet as fast as possible. I know of congregations that have been supporting mission efforts, the same mission efforts for 20, 30 years, right? And if they pulled their money out, the congregations would collapse because the mission congregations are dependent on their money. They've never grown spiritually enough to support themselves. They've never grown spiritually to not only support themselves, but much less support other people. And so I think it's something that, maybe we need to work at. Maybe we need to have different expectations more in line with the Apostle Paul. Marcy, did you have anything?
I was just thinking, some of the in countries other than the United States, their level of income is nowhere near, even if you compare it, it's nowhere near what we can make here in the United States.
Yeah.
So I can see where it might be a longer term thing somewhere else. The United States probably can get on their feet quicker.
Mm-hmm.
There's a congregation that is supporting in the United States. Incomes are higher.
And that brings up another point. Sometimes when we establish mission congregations, we want to Americanize them, right? We think that they have to have, a building. We think that they have to have a church van, and we think they have to have a new building or, a big structure. When in fact, that's not really what we see in the New Testament. And so what happens when we do all of that, we build all of this infrastructure into the mission plan, then it's extremely difficult to pull away from that congregation because, like you said, their income doesn't support all of that infrastructure. And so when we think about mission works, we need to be thinking about what's going to work for them long term, right? And what's going to fit their income level, and what's going to allow us to pull out without them collapsing. Good comment. Anybody else? Diane?
But wouldn't that exception be a small congregation that just cannot grow even though they're trying? But you wouldn't want to pull that congregation out of the community just because it's not their fault they're not growing.
Well, let me ask you this. I'll answer your question with a question. What would the Apostle Paul do?
Well, I think he would keep visiting and encouraging them.
Sure, encouraging them and visiting them, but I don't think he would continue to support them, right? His expectation was that they do it themselves.
Well, not necessarily if it wasn't their fault.
what is the motive?
Well, you can tell by their membership.
And also, if a minister is still visiting them, someone is supporting the minister. Go there.
Right. Who was supporting Paul? He was expecting these congregations to support him as he went around. And I'm not saying that we have, that we expect our missionaries to be self-supporting. What I am trying to make the point is that Paul's expectation was that these congregations do their job. And if they're really doing their job, I believe God will bless them, and God will help them to grow. Yeah.
So, but on a level, the congregations were 100% supporting Paul. Paul had his own work as a tanner, he says, what the scripture says he was doing while he was ministering. So the congregations that were supporting Paul weren't supporting him 100%, so it's not they're exactly on the duty of the entire congregation to 100% support him.
Yeah, and that's a good comment. While in Corinth, Paul was working with Aquila and Priscilla as a tent maker, right? And he was earning some of his own income. In fact, he didn't take anything from the church, but he rebuked them. He rebuked them later on. He said, other congregations that were just as young as you supported me while I was with you.
I just want to bring up a few comments about Laura, where Luke and Megan are. They had a decent sized congregation, and they had missionaries that were supported 100%. And when the missionaries left, the congregation pretty much went down to nothing because there was no money. This is what Luke said to us. So they had to somebody else had to bring in a preacher just to get the church going again. And also with the funding, when you fund a congregation, they don't need to make the kind of money that we make around here. Just like in Flora, the cost of living is so much cheaper. So, like you said, don't Americanize it, because that's not what these people live on. They live on a lot less. And if we give them more, are they doing it for the right reasons? Are they a missionary for the right reasons?
Okay. Anyone else? So, I think we have to understand, I think it's important to understand that there are so many places around the world that people have never heard the gospel. And, people might say, oh, we're just one congregation. And we are. And we, in the scope of things, we can't reach everybody ourselves. But the question is, can we do a better job of reaching people in different locations? Can we expand our mission field by moving on? There's nothing that I see in the New Testament that says we have to stay in a mission field forever. And in fact, I see the opposite of that. We need to keep going, keep moving, not be satisfied with just having a list of mission efforts on our bulletin, and we need to feel the urgency, I believe, of reaching others who have never had that opportunity to hear and obey the gospel. All right. Anything else? I think we're out of time, so appreciate your attention and comments.